Hi, I'm Faye Wright, and I am the nurse scientist here at Northern Westchester Hospital. Really excited to be here with you today to talk about evidence-based practice and research here at Northern. These slides were prepared as part of the evidence-based task force at the Northwell Health System level. And so you can see the names of everybody there who was part of that task force. But Johanna, the current chair of the NWH Evidence-Based Practice and Research Council, or as we call it, EBPR, and I have adapted these to Northern. So why are we doing this? Why do you get dedicated time and orientation to learn about evidence-based practice at NWH? Well, part of the reason is because Northwell and we, as part of Northwell, have a vision that we will have a spirit of inquiry and emerge as a global leader in patient care that is using best evidence-based practice. So what is a spirit of inquiry? Good question. Spirit of inquiry is really saying, is this the best way to do things? Is really looking at what is the status quo? Why have we always done it this way? And is there a high level of high quality evidence that can change the way we do things to improve our processes and to improve patient care? Whoops, too fast. Evidence-based practice is part of the core competencies for health professionals. These are the core competencies that were identified by the Institute of Medicine, or IOM, which has now recently been renamed as the National Academy of Medicine. And they really speak to that we should engage in evidence-based practice as a foundation for improving the quality of our patient care. On top of the IOM, or the Academy of Medicine's competencies, we also have the Quality Safety Education for Nurses, or QSEN, evidence-based practice, EBP competencies. And what these competencies really do is it's a 4-step process that looks at describing an evidence-based practice, identifying significant, high-quality, high levels of evidence, looking at how we search for that evidence, and then summarizing it to make a practice change. So let's get to some definitions, because we talk about evidence-based practice, but we know that we often think about evidence-based practice and research and quality improvement as kind of an all mushed together concept. So what I'd like to do is to give you the exact meaning of research, EBP, and then performance improvement or quality improvement. So here's the definitions that have been approved by the Northwell system for us to describe evidence-based practice, research, and quality improvement. And these also are from the Magnet document, okay? So research is a scientific process that validates and refines existing knowledge and generates new knowledge. The generate new knowledge is a key component. It makes new knowledge, okay? And that knowledge directly or indirectly influences patient care, nursing practice, or the practice across health systems. And then EBP is a rigorous process that answers clinical, education, or administrative questions through a systematic search, critical appraisal of the highest level of relevant evidence to answer the question and to implement that evidence into practice. And then performance improvement or quality improvement is also a systematic approach to sustain and improve specific internal processes, or performance and productivity for optimal patient care. All 3 of these professional performance definitions are rigorous, are systematic, and involve a high level of commitment to improving patient care quality. And they have overlaps. Not only are they all rigorous, but research informs EBP and QI, right? Because research is generating new knowledge to improve practice through evidence-based practice, implementing that new knowledge. And QI monitors the implementation to be sure that it's consistent. I didn't change that, sorry. And evidence-based practice informs QI because there's opportunities for us to monitor the process, and it might bring up questions we can't answer with evidence, okay? And QI can inform EBP in that when we're looking at our normal policies and procedures, the way we do things, we might identify that there are gaps, that we need either research or we need to increase the evidence that's supporting our current processes. Make sense? So, at Northwell Health, we use the Stephen Star model of knowledge transformation. And this provides an overarching model that, if you look, you start at the first star point of discovery research, which is generating new knowledge, and then an evidence summary with translation to guidelines, which really looks at that transfer of the discovery knowledge into practice through EBP, and then to process outcome evaluation, which is part of the QI process. So we generate new knowledge. Let's talk about what is nursing research. My personal hero, Florence Nightingale. Florence Nightingale was the first nurse scientist. It was through Florence's use of statistics and data that she saved lives. She was the first person to say nurses have an independent practice when we use data. So what is nursing research? Again, a definition. It's clinical, basic, and translational research on the science of health, which focuses on the promotion of health and quality of life. It's seeking innovative methods to optimize patient outcomes and contain costs. And nursing science generates knowledge to enhance the evidence base related to clinical practice, to preventing illness, to manage symptoms, to proving lives across the lifespan. And that's part of the National Institute of Nursing Research strategic plan. We're generating knowledge that can be translated into practice. So you all should know that in the National Institute of Health, there is a separate independent institute called the National Institute for Nursing Research that funds nursing research to improve patient care. So what is evidence-based practice? Let's take that definition. And it really is a framework for clinical decision-making that uses the highest level of the highest quality of evidence with the clinician's expertise and patient's values and preferences to answer clinical questions, evaluate the effectiveness of that, and improve patient outcomes. Starts at star point 2, where we gather the evidence, we critique and rate it, and we develop recommendations. Not all evidence is created equal. You've heard me say repeatedly, the highest level of the highest quality of evidence. And that's really important because just because something's published doesn't mean it's necessarily good. Doesn't mean you should actually use it in your clinical setting. And that's where that gathering through a literature search, but then critique and rate it before we can develop it, recommendations. So just in case you haven't gotten it from my little presentation thus far, EBP is incredibly important because it provides our knowledge for clinical decision making. It can standardize healthcare practices, which reduces variation. And variation, while we want to individualize patient care, variation can actually cause some problems with outcomes. Because if we are not using the best evidence to individualize our care, we could provide substandard care based on some non-scientific assessments. So at Northwell Health, we have developed an algorithm which is available to you on the Northwell Internet that covers the steps of the EBP process. And you're receiving that handout now as part of watching this and learning it or sitting in this class. So I refer you to those handouts. And we're going to go through each step of the process of the algorithm. And you'll see how it's 1, 2, 3. We formulate a clinical question, we locate, appraise, and synthesize the evidence, and then we translate that evidence into practice. So when we formulate the question, evidence-based practice has a very specific format of a question. It's a PICO question, where we really look at the patient or the population, the intervention, that current practice that we're comparing, and the outcome. A PICO question is very different from a research question. A research question asks, what's the best way to improve care in an endoscopy unit? Versus a PICO question asks, in children receiving endoscopy in a hospital-based endoscopy unit, does a specialized social story education compared to current education practice decrease stress, decrease the amount of analgesia and sedation used, and improve outcomes? See the difference? Measurable, focused, not generating knowledge, looking at translating that evidence into practice. And that was an example of one of our award-winning EBP projects here. So after we have our clinical question, we're going to locate, appraise, and synthesize the evidence. So we will be using tables of evidence, what I lovingly refer to as a TOE, where we'll identify the level of evidence, which the next slide will go over a bit more. We'll appraise the evidence with checklists, and we'll evaluate the strength and quality of the evidence for translation into practice using a grade system. We'll then synthesize this individual evidence, and we'll look at how we're answering our PICO question and determine if we should be changing practice based on the evidence. So, not all evidence is created equal. This is the hierarchy of evidence that we use here at Northwell Health. It was developed by Melnick and Feinholt Overholt. And basically, we try to use the highest level of evidence possible, which is a systematic review or a meta-analysis of clinical trials. So we have a high experimental level of study that has been synthesized. Somebody has gotten all of these studies and put them together into a review, either narratively, which is a systematic review, or in a meta-analysis where they've taken the data from 10 studies and put it together in one reanalysis. So you have increased sample size, increased power, increased ability to change practice. Or just from the RCT, or clinical trials without randomization. But the idea is the higher level on this evidence hierarchy, you can have more confidence in using the evidence to change practice, okay? But remember, we saw in the EBP model that we use the highest level of the highest quality of evidence, and we still have to evaluate it for our practice setting. But so, I'll give you a great example. We found a fabulous meta-analysis of multiple studies about the use of peripheral IVs to draw blood. And we were in the middle of doing a project that looked at could we draw blood out of a standing IV in the ER to prevent another venipuncture. And this meta-analysis showed that absolutely not, you should not do it. You increase infection rate, and it was absolutely not recommended. So the staff nurses who were in charge of that project got all upset. They texted me, we talked about it at council, but we had to use our clinicians' experience, and we had to think about the applicability to our setting. That was a meta-analysis of data collected in field hospitals in sub-Sahara Africa. So it was people who had IVs placed in the field in Africa under unclean conditions. So of course you wouldn't draw blood from them because you were putting them at risk for infection. So while it was a level 1 level of evidence, it wasn't clinically applicable to our setting. So we didn't need to use it. We need to be aware of it, and it informed that yes, we need to use aseptic technique, but just because it's a high level doesn't mean it's applicable to our setting. And that's where the evaluation comes in with our different checklists. One of the things that we talk about is it applicable to our setting? So I mentioned the table of evidence. So when we find our evidence, we complete these evidence summaries. Now I'm gonna just ask you all to think about, remember when you were in school and you're reading all these articles and you'd highlight and you'd write little notes in the margins, and then you'd go back to study or you'd try to figure out exactly what the pieces of evidence said, and you'd go, where did I write that note? Where's my sticky note? Where's my comments? Well, the table of evidence removes that difficulty finding the takeaways from what you're reading. Because if we do a table of evidence, we already have the citation along the top, we know what the design is, we know what kind of patients were in the sample, we can put right away what interventions they were evaluating, or was it a review, or how did they do the review. We know what the conclusions were of the author, all on one piece of paper. And the beauty then is the final column of the TOE, you as a reviewer of the evidence write what I call the so what. So is it applicable to our setting? Does it inform our practice? If it does answer our question, how? What are my takeaways? So you have it all on one piece of paper. So when you're in your little work groups on a project, you can actually have it in front of you, save time, be more efficient. It also is helpful when we go to write the articles from our projects. We have our literature synthesis almost done. Okay? So, we have identified a PICO question, 1. We have located, critically appraised, and evaluated our evidence, 2. Now we're going to decide if we're going to translate it into practice. And so what we've done is we really look, what levels of evidence have we had? What was the quality? What was the applicability? And if we have strong evidence, we evaluate our current practice. What part of our practice is already being done according to that level of evidence? Where are the gaps? Is our practice currently based on that evidence? And perhaps we just weren't following it? So then we would do QI. Let's improve our practice. Let's follow our current practice. But if our practice wasn't based on that evidence, we would implement the evidence and make a practice change. If we have weak evidence, we still evaluate our current practice and we do a gap analysis and decide, is the weak evidence because this is something that we know and nobody's been doing research on? An example is our blood pressure policy here at Northern Westchester Hospital. We take auscultatory blood pressures on the floors. And the reason is because all of the research that was done says it's the best way to do it. But it's not a high level of evidence, but it's the evidence we have. And it's considered to be the standard of practice in non-repetitive, non-emergent settings. So weaker levels of evidence, but it informed our practice. But we also have weak evidence, and we have to always ensure that we have safe practices and observe positive outcomes. But weak evidence or no evidence, while we're making sure our current practice is safe, we may just need to do research to fill that gap, that there's not a high level of high quality of evidence, strong evidence to change practice. Okay? So once an EB project is implemented, we have to sustain the positive outcomes. And that's where performance improvement, quality improvement comes in. And this is part of our EBP implementation here at Northern. We call this Act, Plan, Do, Study cycle, which is considered to be QI. We call it a small test of change. So before we implement anything into practice and begin to evaluate our outcomes, we do a QI, a small test of change, on the process of implementation. Okay? We look at the process. Great example is we were implementing a brand new, you'll all be working with the POS sedation scale. And we started to implement it, and we linked it to some of our opioid orders. And we found difficulty in the way it was linked, the way the staff could complete it, and the reading of it. So people were not consistently doing it. So what we had to do then is evaluate why weren't people doing it. Instead of automatically assuming people weren't doing it or they didn't value it, we had to identify there was a process problem with the way the electronic medical record was working. We stopped what we were doing, we fixed the EMR, we put it back into place. It worked. Then once we made sure that process through the small test of change worked, then we could begin to evaluate the outcomes on sedation, the outcomes on the number of RRTs that were called. Only through quality focus, small test of change focus on ensuring that the way we're implementing the change is being done consistently across care providers, can we then say it either is improving care or not. Make sense? So research EBP and PIQI are all part of the NAGNT model. They're the new knowledge, innovations, and improvements, which we call NK. And NK, the expectations are for us to have 2 completed IRB-approved studies and 1 in progress IRB study. IRB is Institutional Review Board. It means there's a group of scientists who review the research we're doing, say it's ethical, say it's meaningful, and that we have enough knowledge and resources to do it and make it meaningful, okay? And so NK1, 2 complete, 1 in progress. NK2 is that we disseminate our nursing research to internal and external audiences. Northern Westchester consistently exceeds the magnet expectations. And within the Northwell system, we are the leader in the quality of our research that is nursing focused and our evidence-based practice. So part of the NK for EBP is that we develop 1 new and we improve 1 existing practice based on evidence, and that we use clinical specialty organization standards and guidelines. And one of the ways we're doing that is we're actually, right now, we're getting ready to go live with changing our length of dwell time with our peripheral IVs, because the Nurses Infusion Society recommends that you put in a peripheral IV and you leave it till it goes bad. And we still have been changing everything Q72. Okay? So what are the key takeaways? Research generates new knowledge. Evidence-based practice translates that new knowledge, and QI sustains existing knowledge and process improvement and activities. So give you a few really cool examples. So this is the completion of our DAISY Foundation-funded nurse-driven research. Now, I didn't expect you to see the little graphs at the bottom, but I just wanted you to see how rigorous this research was. That we really asked a question that in a sample of adults admitted to inpatient hospitals, what is the equivalence of blood samples collected? Is there equivalence between a peripheral venipuncture and a saline lock device? This is different than the project in the emergency room. We actually used patients as their own control. We would draw blood from one arm and through venipuncture and standard of practice, and we would draw blood from their saline lock device through the other. And while we found that we significantly decreased pain and decreased patient anxiety, and the majority of the samples were clinically equivalent, we had some statistical differences on some key samples like sodium, BUN, calcium, and AST. So because of that, in conversation with our chief of medicine, we made the decision that we could not change practice. But we didn't lose any IVs because it was just too risky. And what the bottom graphs that you can't see too well really show you where within those red lines is where the clinical equivalence would be. So that's one of our research studies. Here's the POS project I mentioned about sedation with EBP. And we developed the algorithm, we changed the Meditech, that we really were looking at decreasing RRTs and improving the effectiveness of pain management while decreasing the sedation effects. And that's just the POS algorithm that you'll all become very familiar with. And this is our award-winning Falls project. We developed an evidence-based approach and integrated video monitoring, and we decreased our falls, we increased patient satisfaction, and we won the Clinical Practice Team Improvement Award from the Foundation of New York State Nurses, and we won the Eastern Nursing Research Society Award for Best Evidence-Based Practice in 2018. Very, very proud of this project. It took us 18 months to get to the first small test of change. Evidence-based practice is not quick and dirty. It is a rigorous process, but when you spend time on the process, you really improve outcomes and sustain those outcomes. So I just advise you to refer to the algorithm. Each unit has an evidence-based practice and research rep. Talk to them with your clinical questions. You're also receiving a handout of how the EBPR Council reviews ideas about your PICO questions or your research questions, and refer to them and to look at the posters on your unit. And thank you very much for your commitment to improving patient care through the use of evidence.